Hey all, I am confused. When it comes to the trail games, we are perhaps most used to adventures that place great emphasis on the extensive range of characters, turn-based battles and deep narratives that often meander in many directions. Nayuta is considered a spin-off game to the Trail series, but which goes in its own direction. Certainly there are several similarities to the Trail games, above all how the game is presented purely visually and stylistically. But even though you're sucked straight into a world you've probably recognized from before, the references to the Trail series are relatively vague, and I am really asking myself, where does Nayuta fit into the series? I can't recall seeing any character in this game appear in any other Trails game, and the areas and islands that Nayuta takes place on are nowhere to be found anywhere in the series. But maybe I am wrong, and maybe my memory is bad, and I'd like to see a discussion about how Nayuta fits in, because I've been able to read that this is supposed to be a spin-off game, but would like more information about how the games are connected. So if you know anything about this, please comment below. Having said that, The Legend of Nayuta Boundless Trails is an action RPG that has been with us for a while. It was already released in 2012 for PlayStation Portable, but has now come in a new version for Nintendo Switch. You can now buy the game in Nintendo's eShop and the price is set at $40. As usual, NIS America also sells physical copies of the game. Partly there is a regular version available, but also a limited version. And with that said, let's take a closer look at what this game is really about. So let's start by talking about the game's story, which largely revolves around our protagonist Nayuta and his friend Signa. They return home after a long journey and see ruins falling from the sky. After some circumstances, they decide to explore these places and make discoveries that form the basis of how this adventure will play out. Among other things, they meet a couple of scoundrels whose intentions are anything but good. But at the beginning, the goal of the evil ones is not entirely clear, other than we suspect that they want to do harm. So, without further ado, I want to say that the setup is relatively simple. It's very black and white, who is considered good and who is evil. But what gives the narrative its value are the twists and turns that occur during the course of the game. Because things happen that I couldn't foresee, and this is exactly what makes the story engaging. There is definitely a tension between the game's main characters Nayuta and Signa, and I want to claim that it's their relationship and the events between them that contribute to the narrative feeling exciting, but also that the developers choose to stick to a relatively small cast. It is easy to follow along in the plot, and you get to know a few characters in depth. So even though the world is big and the inhabitants many, it's always clear who is in the center of attention and where the main tension points are. Of course, I don't want to spoil anything, but apart from Nayuta and Signa, there are 3 to 4 more characters that carry this narrative forward. So it's a small cast, but everyone contributes to making the story exciting. I read beforehand that the game runs at 60 FPS, and at first glance I have to say that this game feels very smooth to play. Since this is an action RPG that occasionally tests your reaction skills, a good frame rate is necessary for the experience to feel as smooth as possible. The fights can be intense, where fast melee attacks can be combined with magic spells and different ways to protect yourself. But of course I started by just getting a feel for it, to see how responsive and easy it felt to run around and eliminate enemies. Basically, it felt good. But when I ran some frame rate tests, I got it confirmed. This is very solid. In principle, regardless of where you are or what you are doing, it feels smooth to run and jump in different environments. It works well to combat the majority of enemies, and the boss battles are stable. I am very positive about this and must say that the performance is high. So if you fail or get game over, you should probably not complain about a low frame rate. If things go wrong, it's more the player's ability than the game itself. Since this is an action RPG, we put aside the turn-based battles and focus entirely on the use of one-handed swords, two-handed swords, magic spells, and how they can be used against the forces of evil. On the various stages, you mostly fight against fantasy creatures, where each creature has its own characteristics to watch out for. And I have to say that the feeling of swinging the sword and slashing the enemy feels appealing. It's almost a bit strange, but after I got my first wooden sword and made a few simple swings, it was almost like I could say, yeah, this is it. This is how it's supposed to feel. This is how it should feel when you fight with a sword. The swing is relatively fast, and you can dish out reasonable damage relatively quickly. It feels particularly rewarding when you fight against several enemies at the same time and build up chains that in the long run cause you to get temporary boosts. A really fun aspect of the game actually. And the choice is between one-handed and two-handed swords, where the first is faster but does lower damage. Two-handed swords on the other hand are slower but more powerful, so the choice is there to fight in a way that suits you the best. In combination with one sword, you can also take advantage of your companion's abilities. Her skills are magic based and can be seen as a complement to one's melee weapons. There is a plethora of different magical abilities that are unlocked the further into the game you go. For example, you can shoot streams of pink projectiles or use ice attacks that move along the ground. What is worth noting is that you have limited ammo, so the magical abilities can easily run out if you are not careful. But this is where one's artillery of weapon is noticeable. This is because different enemies have different strengths and sometimes it can be risky to rely on your melee weapon, then it's much better to use magic spells. So there is a point in learning how the enemy acts so you can adapt accordingly. And even though I experience moments of button mashing, I still want to point out that the enemy's abilities make you have to stop and think which weapon should be used at the moment. So there is a balance between choosing the right weapon, being frugal with the ammo, and knowing which weapon should be used in each situation. The world you explore consists of two parts. On the one hand, you run around in the upper world, which basically functions as the game's hub. Here you buy weapons and armor, upgrade your character and interact with NPCs to solve problems and complete various quests. It's a fairly small and compact island, so it's easy to move between the beaches and the different buildings, but the majority of all the action and exploration happens somewhere else entirely. This world is called Terra and is accessed through a portal located in a specific tree. Here you will find a few different continents that can all be explored the further into the game you go. At first, only Altopia is open, and to reach the next continent you must first run through some stages and fight a boss. The design of the stages is basically quite linear. Most of the time you run around in narrow corridors where all the enemies can be found. But the paths gradually become more complex, and since there are no maps available, it can sometimes be a challenge to navigate. It can happen that you run around and look without knowing where you are or where to go. It's like driving the car through town without using the GPS or seeing any street names. It can be confusing. However, each stage has some predetermined objectives and they act as hints to encourage investigation. It can be about finding chests, finding crystals, or destroying various objects. Unfortunately, I found it to be a bit tiring in the long run. The variation is certainly good, but the pattern becomes clear over time. Enter a stage, fight monsters, find the crystals, chests, and possibly some important item. Repeat. In other words, there is definitely a grindy aspect here, and it can get a bit monotonous and repetitive, but I still think that the developers solved this in a good way by creating a dynamic experience. That is, the combination of a lot of RP, doing quests and fighting enemies and bosses, as well as finding items and a lot of problem solving. I would also like to add that many stages can be a bit tricky. Sometimes they are structured like small puzzles. It can be about finding switches to open up new paths, or using specific abilities to remove rubble. In addition, your character can jump between different platforms, which contributes to a more varied gameplay. But in conclusion, I can say that much of the gameplay is about exploration and mastering a varied range of challenges, so even though it can sometimes feel a bit grind heavy, there is still a lot to do in this game. When you have completed a number of stages, a boss fight awaits. What you see here are images from the first boss, and clearly this is a fun aspect of the game, as they are completely unpredictable. If you try to surge a boss, there is a risk that you yourself will take damage and die. Rather, it's about calmly understanding the mechanics of the bosses and what abilities they have. Most bosses also have several phases where new trials await. But if you think that something is too easy or too difficult, you can set the degree of difficulty. You can choose between easy, normal and hard. So with this in mind, the game is aimed at everything from the beginner to those who are used to this type of game. Nayuta is a game that is basically worth its $40, no doubt about it. If you're going to get through the whole adventure and also try to complete it 100%, then you have many hours ahead of you. And although I have already mentioned the main aspects of the game, I also want to mention that there is a cooking system where you can learn new dishes and which also gives you experience points. So by fighting enemies and cooking food, you can level up and get a bigger health pool. It's also possible to buy or find armor, which is needed to become resistant to the enemy. In addition to the weapon you use, you can also use helmets, pants and body armor. Some armor is purchasable, but other items are tied to exploring the world. So here are other aspects of the game to reckon with. There is a dual purpose in both gathering capital and exploring the world, namely to be able to access the valuable equipment. I would also like to add that I played the game in both docked mode and in handheld mode, and the experience is roughly the same. It flows smoothly regardless of how you choose to play. I haven't experienced any crashes or weird bugs either, so overall this is a very solid game. What I want to point out again is that the game can tend to become a bit grind heavy and may require that you invest some time in order to build a strong warrior. And not everyone appreciates games where you have to replay stages over and over to collect capital or find specific items. But having said that, I still want to say that this is basically a very good action RPG with a nice pace where the mix between RP, action and exploration forms the basis. Feel free to subscribe to my channel. I review new games every week. Have a nice day. See ya!